Welcome to the Topic of the Month with Kim Wardlow, an AINC original podcast. It's not easy being blind or going through vision loss, but we'll help you navigate these waters. Press on. Push forward. You've got this.
Hello and welcome back this week for our topic of the month, which is mental health. We are joined again today by Bill Lundgren, who is a certified employee assistance professional, licensed professional counselor, and holds an addiction counselor certification from the state of Colorado. So very well qualified to be providing us information during this month. The first week, we did an overview of mental health and how you might go about finding a counselor. Last week, we talked about addiction. And this week, we are talking about abuse and trauma. Bill, I'm just wondering, as I think about those two words, I know all trauma is not abuse, but is abuse then a subset of trauma?
Well, abuse of any kind is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma, when we talk about recovering from trauma, that can also include, say, if someone has lost their sight because of an auto accident or because of a gunshot. There are all kinds of ways that people can lose their eyesight. And let's face it, to lose our eyesight, it can be traumatic. If we've been sighted and all of a sudden we aren't, or we gradually lose, and all of a sudden we realize we can't see anymore. We see very little anymore. That is a jolt to our system, and that really comes under the category of trauma, and trauma can be different degrees.
Mm-hmm.
But now abuse is something, in some ways, in a macabre way, maybe, a therapist looks at abuse, what constitutes abuse? And oftentimes the person who is in the situation doesn't realize that he or she is being abused. They just take it as normal. Mm-hmm. I've had kids or adults who describe when they were kids, they were hit with objects by their parents, but they didn't consider that abuse. And unfortunately, when they become parents, they may do the same thing to their kids because that's a normal way of operating. And they don't know that that's abuse. People who are having massive fights so loud that the neighbors are calling the cops, but they're never physical. People tend to not consider that abuse. That's emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big problems from a therapy standpoint is helping people to understand they're being abused and that they need to get out of that situation. It's unsafe. And one of the statistics, again, when we look at the whole population that is considered disabled, way high list of sexual abuse for both men and women. Extraordinary numbers. Growing up with a disability, they're very likely to have been subject to sexual abuse. And sometimes they block it out. It's under the surface. They don't know. They don't remember. And part of their work of recovery is to access that information and deal with it and begin to reconcile in their minds. That it has nothing, because the most abusive part is, particularly for children, is they assume they must have done something wrong and deserved it.
Right.
And that's what has to change. And then you see when this stuff starts coming up, that's where we get into the drinking, may get into the drinking or self-injurious behavior, which has to be dealt with. And if someone is grown up blind, that's one of the things that I think a counselor has to sort of gently find out if that was involved and what they consider it to be. Very serious issue. And fortunately, now more and more therapists are paying attention to it. And again, this is there are trauma therapists who will specialize in that area. One of the techniques that are used in treatment of trauma is called EMDR, which is eye movement reprocessing, which is a technique which relies on using the senses. And it has to be done a little differently with people who are blind than with the visual. What they've been developing is some ways that they can work around it where it's a matter of touch, because it originally started where you waved your hand, the therapist waved his or her hand in front of the person who's doing the receiving the work, and allowing the person to get past the barrier that keeps them from accessing that memory, and also reduces the impact of the. In other words, you can look at it as you experiencing the memory in a more objective way, and it's been very successful technique. Mm-hmm. But again, you can't wave in front of your hand in front of somebody who's blind. So so the therapist has to figure out different ways of doing. There are. You can do there's some devices that the person holds in his or her hands, and it buzzes back and forth in a rhythmic kind of thing. It's a self-hypnotic technique, very successful. But other techniques are just talk therapy and so forth. But it is trauma. It is trauma that produces all kinds of mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and it's often the root. Once you get to that trauma, you can then heal the other parts of, the other diagnostic labels that we put on people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can imagine some people would hesitate to seek that kind of help because having those types of memories could be very painful, could be frightening.
Right.
And just not wanting to go back to those memories, and yet that might be what is causing their mental health issues.
Right. And they think, well, it's past, it's done, I should be over it. Mm-hmm. And that's not true. What your brain retains all that memory. And that's why I particularly mention EMDR, because it's a less traumatic way of accessing that memory. Mm-hmm. I remember in the old days, we used to ask people to verbalize and actually go through the trauma again. And I just shudder to think that, that was what we were taught to do. We don't have to do that anymore. They may go back over it, but they go back over it in a way that isn't re-traumatizing.
Right. I think that might be reassuring to folks who might be listening and considering getting help in this area, that some of the treatments they may have heard about in the past have changed. Or are there other misconceptions about getting help with trauma and abuse issues?
Well, I think one of the things that happens in terms of, let me separate into abuse first, because it's a tricky part. That's where the marriage counselor may have to be, a couples counselor may have to be involved if it's being done by the partner. This is where the school it's important for the school to pay attention to abuses on the child's body, and the child will rationalize. The people around the person have to pay attention to these things, and when you feel suspicious, it really would be helpful to report it. And there are many parts like teachers, therapists, and so forth. It's mandatory in Colorado that it's reported, and
Right.
that's good. The problem is trying to get the child to admit it. The other thing is to get the adult to admit what's going on, and to get help for everybody in the family. And because one of the sad things is that it tends to be a multi-generational thing. If parents were abused, they'll abuse the kids, and the kids, when they grow up, they'll abuse their kids, and it doesn't it doesn't stop until we stop it. We get help for the person. In terms of that's abuse. Now, in terms of trauma, there are different things that the misconception is always, well, I'm blind, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, yeah, that's probably true, but your feelings about your blindness are what we need. What I see as a model is that we have a disability, that we come to accept and adapt to that ability to do whatever it is that we want to do, to not have it stop us. So the fact that we're, someone who's blind who wants to drive an 18-wheeler, that's not necessarily going to happen. In fact, I remember when I was in the treatment center, had a bunch of classmates were in my apartment, and we were, of course, passing a wine bottle around. And somebody said, well, how can a blind person rob a bank? And so they discussed that for about an hour. And the only thing I could add is that I would have to dye my dog's hair a different color to rob a bank. But the point is, we want to do things, and that's part of the trauma when we have wishes and hopes that we can't do because we're blind, or we perceive that we can't do. And the trauma the biggest part of the trauma is the loss of hope. And the same for abuse, that matter. When we lose hope, we lose everything. But we don't have to, and that's why, there has to be so much emphasis on how can we do things differently. And as big a joke as it was for us to talk about bank robbing, it certainly forces us to say, well, there are different ways that we can do the things that we want to do. We don't have to necessarily give up.
Right. Are there other types of therapies that you see being used today for trauma, or particularly for blind individuals?
Well, this is what I'm real hoping that our podcast is going to do, is to help us find the people who are doing trauma work with blind people. Because and this is true, I go to to conferences on different subjects, and I'm the only blind person there, or the only disabled person there. And the therapists there tend to avoid me like the plague, unless they're the caretakers who want to take over for me. As I say, the caretaker is the one who wants to chew my food for me. And, and this is, and these were therapists. I say,
right.
Hey,
they should
gang,
know better.
Yeah, they should know better, but we don't. We're human. And so in terms of who's doing work with blind people, we're just finding out. And this is what I hope people will step forward and say, oh, I work with trauma, and this is how I do it. There are ways to do it. And friends of mine who are sighted people, I've been talking to them about, okay, what do we do if you have a client who comes in who's blind? How do you adapt EMDR? How do you adapt the talk therapy? How do you deal with memory? And so that people can understand that in many ways, should get treated the same, but in some significant ways, our differences have to be respected and helped and assisted. The person who gets abused, if they're blind, they're afraid to leave because if I leave this abusive relationship, who's going to take care of me? Who's going to be there for me? I can't do it by myself.
Right.
And so somebody who has a disability stays in far longer and, and don't find out that they can do perfectly well without the abuser.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that fear, and the longer you're in it, the more you're being told what you can't do, or you're not capable, you're not good, whatever the negative messages are that you're receiving, and buying into that more.
Absolutely. Yeah, which of course lowers your self-esteem, continues to make you feel less than. As long as you're feeling less than, you're grateful to have even the abuser be there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the cycle that had to be broken. And some people, when you say, oh, you were abused, they look at me like, huh? That's the way we did it in our family. And that's really sad.
That is sad. How does a person, if they're questioning, if they're in an abusive situation, as you mentioned, if you're being physically attacked or hit or those types of things, that seems a bit more clear, that's right. Abuse. I think most people agree on that. But some of the other types of, verbal, psychological, emotional abuse, how do people begin to identify, wow, this actually might be an abusive situation that I need to get out of?
Well, one of the unfortunate things is that the abused tend to isolate. Mm-hmm. And so, because a big thing is when somebody that knows them say, you're being abused. And it might be the first time they've even entertained the thought. So, but the thing is, how do we find that person is isolated and being abused? Sometimes it's the doctor has to pay attention to when somebody comes in with unexplained bruises, when someone, or ideally, they come into counseling for something else. Mm-hmm. And we then are able to report the abuse and able to help them deal with the abuse and to leave the relationship. Sometimes that's where clergy can be very helpful. And sometimes and sometimes the first time that something shifts is when a neighbor knows about a fight, or as I said, the neighbor hears all this yelling and reports it, and then the police get involved. Now, the police have a little bit of a problem when they're not really equipped to deal with mental health issues. That's why this new system that 911 is established at the city of Denver, where they're sending social workers out instead of police or along with police to deal with mental health issues and get the person, instead of being incarcerated, to get them into treatment. And that we need to do more of that. We need to pay attention to the clues that we're being given and get people involved who can look beyond the legal question and look to, I think this woman is being abused, and I'm reporting the husband for domestic abuse, if it's a male, female kind of thing. A lot of LGBT people are in abusive relationships, unfortunately. And then and something gets started, and then, there are domestic abuse classes for the abuser, but there also needs to be help for the abused. But it's a matter of, sometimes it's a matter of luck that we find out.
Right. Well, and I always think of getting help for the person being abused, and had not thought so much about what you just mentioned, that the abuser also needs help in order to break that cycle of behavior.
One of the things that we're coming to realize, and I know every woman who's listening understands, that it tends to be the male that is the abuser because men are not allowed to grieve, to cry. Women who are abusive or violent and so forth, they meet people immediately say, "Oh, she needs help," because women aren't supposed to do this. Women are supposed to be the comforters. We're not supposed to be the ones who get angry. In fact, we have this in work situations. If a woman gets angry at a work situation when they say, "You need help," but if a guy gets angry at a work situation, they say, "Oh, that's the way he is."
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is, so much that we're finding now, alcoholism, domestic abuse, and it's only recently that we've been testing for this. Domestic abuse, the abuser often has a severe depressive disorder. And because of the only way he can express his depression is through violence, there you go. So the abuser needs as much help as the abused.
Well, one aspect that has had more emphasis in recent years, we've talked about children and mandatory reporting of abuse of minors, but also older adults,
Yes.
elderly, and the abuse that can occur there. It might be financial abuse.
Yes.
Those types of things also, and there are individuals that are mandatory reporters for elder abuse as well.
Right. And one of the things that, for example, banks are beginning to take a look at, making their employees aware when they're dealing with an elderly person to pay attention to that kind of thing, to unusual withdrawals from the account, or even, if an older person comes in with someone and you have a feeling that something's not right here, it's real important to be able for that person, that bank teller, or that bank employee, to kind of check it out, or let your manager know, something that feels fishy about this.
Mm-hmm.
You'd be surprised at people who say, something didn't feel right, but I just didn't know what to do about it. And particularly after somebody's been off to the hospital because they've been beaten, but a neighbor says, "Yeah, I knew something was wrong in this, but I just didn't want to speak up because I didn't know for sure."
Right, I didn't want to interfere or
Right, exactly. And
have a false accusation.
And this is where we come into what I talk about constantly with clients and others around it. Pay attention to your gut.
Mm-hmm.
Your gut will tell you a lot of things if you just listen. And you may be wrong, but I'd rather you be wrong than sorry later.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it comes down to. But I'm glad you brought up the elder. That's another thing. And someone who's blind. Okay, who's handling the bank account?
Mm-hmm.
Who's signing the checks? How much leeway has the person given to someone else to handle your financial affairs when they may be perfectly capable of handling themselves? Or if they're not, is this person a safe person to allow that to be handling your account? And are you keeping an eye on it?
Well, and I've been shocked and saddened when I have heard statistics about how often, and I'm thinking in particular about elder abuse, that the abuser is a family member. It's someone who has been trusted. How can a person who is in that situation, they're reliant upon that person in some way, how can they reach out and get help without putting themselves in jeopardy, if they need to, if they're trying to reach out,
that's what
and get help when that person's around all the time.
Right, and that's it. And that the if there's another family member that you trust, see, it had to do with who do you trust.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you feel that this person is one person is taking advantage of you, then if you can tell a neighbor or someone who's not in the situation, say, this is what I'm concerned about, and the neighbor is willing to say, okay, let me, here's a lawyer I think you might want to talk to, or make a referral. And here's where it becomes so important. We look to the professionals to do the job. And the two things I tell people about professionals, one is, we can't change somebody. There's no way that I can change you or anybody else. I can show the person how to change. I can show them what they need to do. But if they don't want to change, PhD, MD, whatever it is, it won't work. All we can do is show and tell them how to change and make them understand why they need to change. The same for the other group are the people around someone who's blind or some around the elderly person, to take responsibility, not to take away responsibility from the person, but to keep an eye out. Mm-hmm. And if you see something suspicious, it's well to talk to the individual or ask the individual, have you talked to your family about what's going on, or in some way encourage the person to do something. And if you really feel that the person, because of dementia or something, is in danger, then I know it sounds nosy and bossy and whatever, but sometimes we have to intervene, take it upon ourselves to intervene gently and get someone else in the family involved and say, this is what I'm noticing. And if you say, this is what I'm noticing, I don't know whether it means anything, but I just feel like someone in the family needs to know, mm-hmm. then they can run with it.
Right.
And you may be wrong. They say, it looks suspicious. And if you say, I'm not certain that this is happening, but this is what I'm seeing or hearing, then the person that you're telling has it, will carry with it and check it out.
Right. Right.
And this is where community helps community. And that's where things like the thing we've been dealing with the pandemic is the isolation. And now hopefully churches are opening up and the people elderly are getting out again. And that's really important, to get people out to be with other people, because that way, they can talk about what's going on for them. It's when they're isolated, when they're afraid to go out of the house and they have only one person to depend on, that's a setup.
Right. Well, once again, Bill, you've given us much to think about and lots of great information on a topic that can be very difficult to discuss. So thank you for everyone listening this week. Next week, Bill will join us again, and we will be talking about grief. I know that's also a difficult topic, but important, and I'm sure Bill will have some words of wisdom for us in that area as well. If you have questions for us, if you have comments, if you are a blind individual has a wonderful counselor that you would like to share who they are with others, feel free to contact us through our website, aincolorado.org/podcast-guest. And we will look forward to receiving questions and comments from you there. We will also have an opportunity in the future to dig deeper into some of these very complicated subjects that are part of the overall mental health topic through a new podcast called Blind Sight that Bill will be hosting, and Audio Information Network will be launching later this year. So we hope that you'll be looking out for that as well if these programs have been helpful to you. So thank you once again, Bill, for joining us, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again next week.